One is that Trump is deadly serious about putting an end to this war, improving relations with Putin and with the Russians more generally. Number two, you do not want to underestimate the amount of contempt that Trump has for the Europeans. And you also don't want to underestimate how anxious he is to greatly reduce, if not eliminate, our commitment to Europe. He basically thinks that NATO belongs in a museum, that it's not useful anymore. So if he had a serious opportunity to pull the United States out of Europe, or at least American troops out of Europe, he might just jump at it. There are three big issues here. One is that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state. It can't be in NATO. There can be no Western security guarantees, which basically add up to de facto membership in NATO. Ukraine has to be NATO. Ukraine has to be neutral. That's point number one. Point two is that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts, plus that's non-negotiable. And then you have the demilitarization point, which is non-negotiable. There may be some minor changes on whether they can have 85,000 troops or 90,000 troops, who knows? But that's just minutia. You want to remember that the demilitarization issue was one of the issues that was discussed in the Istanbul Agreement or Istanbul negotiations back in March, April 2022. So this is not new. And I believe that the Ukrainians had accepted the fact that they would have to demilitarize to the point where they did not present an offensive threat to Russia. So that issue is an old one. It's certainly still on the table. And the Russians are not going to compromise on that issue. The fact is that the Russians have a handful of demands that are non-negotiable. They have made that clear since June 14th of 2024, when those demands were clearly laid out by Putin. Now, General Keene's basic argument is that we can get the Russians to bend because we're in the driver's seat and it's them, the Russians, who are in trouble. This is delusional. The Russians are in the driver's seat. The Ukrainians are in desperate straits. And we are fed up with this war and we want to walk away from it. So Putin is the one who has all the leverage. So I think you're going to get the deal that Putin has basically articulated on June 14th and on a number of other occasions moving forward. And I think that Trump must understand very clearly what the Russian demands are, the main demands that I just described, and that he must have conveyed to the Russians that we will accept those demands. Otherwise, there's no point in Trump continuing to negotiate with Putin and continuing to talk as if we can cut a deal. I've thought for a long time that once it became clear that Trump was bailing on Ukraine, that he was not going to continue to act like Joe Biden toward Ukraine, that would have significant psychological effects on the frontline forces. I used to say to myself, or I say to myself, how could it be otherwise? Yeah. You're losing with American support. You're suffering great casualties. And now the Americans are bailing on you. What's the point of continuing the fight? And then in that scenario, you could imagine the Ukrainian army beginning to crumble. So this could contribute to that for sure. But I do think that what will happen here initially is that I think many Ukrainians will feel good about the fact that Zelensky has played the role of the tough guy with Trump. Well, you could tell two different stories. One is that they will see this, which they obviously will. The whole world will see this. And they'll feel good about what Zelensky did. They'll think that Zelensky stood up for Ukraine and he stood up to Trump. And when Trump tried to browbeat him, Zelensky fired right back. So I think some people will feel that way. Maybe many will feel that way. We're talking here about many Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. But on the other hand, one would think that they would understand. Here again, we're talking about the Ukrainian soldiers, that this means that the United States is through with Ukraine, and at some point it's going to cut off the flow of military aid, and that means Ukraine is doomed. And then the logic that you were spinning out begins to kick in, and that's to say this is all hopeless. So I think what Macron, Starmer, and other Europeans are doing is being very nice to President Trump and telling him that they will make certain concessions here and there. And this is the Europeans talking about making certain concessions on trade and issues like that, so they can stay in the good graces of President Trump and keep the American pacifier over their head. But on the issue of Ukraine, I mean, they surely understand at this point in time that Trump has decided where he's headed, and they're not going to turn that train around. Trump seems to be saying that if Zelensky doesn't agree, if he's going to, cause trouble and make the agreement unworkable, then Trump is going to pull us out. We're out of there, and he's going to leave it to Zelensky to deal with the Russians on his own, or maybe with the Europeans. And I think the belief is that the Ukrainians will quickly realize, and the Europeans will quickly realize, that they're no match for the Russians, and it's time to cut a deal. And if they don't, then Ukraine is going to be further destroyed. I think they understand that there's no way they're going to convince Trump to change course on Ukraine. It's got to be clear to them that the die is cast on that particular issue. I think what they're principally worried about, and it explains why they were so diplomatic, is they don't want to make relations between the United States and Europe any worse than they already are, because they don't want the United States to leave Europe. They don't want NATO to go away. I think the interesting question was the previous question that you raised is, what are we going to do if Ukraine doesn't cooperate? And you were also pointing out that even if Zelensky wanted to cooperate, it may be very difficult for him to do that, given the politics inside of Ukraine. But it's the real wild card here, when all is said and done, I think, is Ukraine. With regard to the Ukrainians, I mean, what does Trump do if he cuts a deal with Putin? And let's just say the Europeans and the Ukrainians drag their feet. They won't go along. The Europeans say they're going to continue to support Ukraine, and Ukraine says it's going to continue to fight the war. What do you do if you're Trump? I would not be surprised if Trump just walked away from both Europe and from the Ukrainians and said, look, I cut a deal. It's an excellent deal from Ukraine's point of view. You're not interested in the deal. You then figure out how you're going to deal with the Russians. I'm out of here. But the question is, what will the Europeans and what will the Ukrainians do? And that's where the real resistance is likely to come from. And I think that Trump can coerce the Europeans to go along with the deal. The Ukrainians are much trickier. It could be that this set of fireworks that we just saw will actually help Trump, because it will send a very clear signal to the Ukrainians that the Americans are playing hardball, and they better agree to the deal that he works out with Putin or else. So it could be that in the end, this will help Trump get the Ukrainians as well as the Europeans on board. In other words, he can tell the Europeans, listen, if you don't sign on to this deal that I've just worked out to shut this war down, I'm out of Europe. And the Europeans do not, under any circumstances, want the United States to exit Europe. So Trump has real coercive leverage there. Two simple reasons. One is the profound Russophobia in the West, and especially in the United States, because of the widespread belief that Putin is responsible for Trump winning in 2016. But that profound Russophobia gets in the way of seeing things clearly. I mean, that's the basic idea, to remake the world in our own image. We're the good guys. Anybody who doesn't have a liberal democratic system like us is a bad guy. And our basic goal is to transform those bad guys into good guys with the belief that we will all then live happily ever after. And then the other thing is that during the unipolar moment, when the Ukraine disaster was set in train, American foreign policy was not run according to realist dictates. It was run according to a liberal ideology. And that liberal ideology was very expansionist in nature. And it not only led to the forever wars, it also led to this crisis with Ukraine. You want to remember that we focus on NATO expansion when we talk about what caused this war, the Ukraine war, that is. But it's important to emphasize that it was just not NATO expansion, because NATO expansion was part of a package deal. And that deal included EU expansion as well as NATO expansion. And it included a color revolution. In the case of Ukraine, it was the Orange Revolution. And the idea was that we were going to put into power in Ukraine someone who would be sympathetic to the West, and we would turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy that was loyal to the United States. It's very important to understand that Donald Trump is the anomaly. And this is why so many Republicans and virtually all Democrats are screaming bloody murder about what Trump is doing with regard to U.S. relations with both Russia and the Europeans. The really important question was what were we going to do when the Cold War ended? The Soviet Union shortly thereafter disappeared, and we were the most powerful state in the world. We could have drawn down our commitments all over the world, reduced the number of bases, spent much less money on defense. But again, we pursued this liberal foreign policy that was designed to remake the world. And the end result is that, if anything, we increased the number of bases. We interfered in the politics of more countries than we even interfered in during the Cold War, and we spent huge amounts of money. But you want to remember that a lot of those bases and that huge Pentagon budget came out of the Cold War, which was a different story than what we saw in the unipolar moment. I like to say that the Republicans and the Democrats are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's true as long as you exclude Trump. But if you bring Trump into the equation, the Republicans with him at the helm look very different than the Democrats. I think initially they thought the United States was so powerful that it could just shove NATO expansion into both Georgia and Ukraine down the Russians' throat. And then I think they also believed that if a war did break out, that we would beat the Russians. I think this is why there was no really serious move on our part to prevent a war in February of 2022. And this is why, once the war started, we advised Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations. We thought we had the Russians right where we wanted them, and we would inflict a decisive defeat on them. And you want to remember that we shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999, and then we did it again in 2004. And I think the widespread belief in the corridors of power in the United States, and this, of course, includes Victoria Nuland, was that we could do it again with regard to Ukraine. I think it's this mentality that informed her thinking, and of course, the thinking of many others as well. Well, the Europeans just don't matter much. There are three players in this situation who really matter. One, obviously, the Russians. Two, obviously, the Americans. And three, obviously, the Ukrainians. But the Europeans don't matter much. To make this deal work, what Trump has to do is he has to satisfy the Russians. And then he has to get the Ukrainians to go along with the deal that Trump works out with the Russians. That's really the essence of what needs to be done here. And they'll in the end go along with whatever Trump and the Russians work out. The key is the Ukrainians. And the Europeans just don't matter much. They don't have much power. And furthermore, without the United States on top of them coordinating things, they're just huge collective action problems at play, and they're at each other's throats. So they just don't matter much. And the other thing is, if you think about this, Trump has no exit option. If he walks away from the negotiations, what does he do then? He ends up as Joe Biden too. And that's not what he wants. And the Russians have surely figured this out, that Trump really has no option but to just go forward. I mean, we're losing on the battlefield. There's no way we can rescue the situation. But you want to understand that from Trump's point of view at this point in time, the name of the game is to make sure he does everything possible to get the Ukrainians to agree to the deal that he works out with the Russians. That's going to be mighty difficult to do. But there's no question, you're right, that if we just cut off the flow of weaponry completely, that Ukraine would be doomed very quickly. And it might make sense. It's very hard to know for sure from outside the Trump administration, but it might make sense to let those weapons that are now in the pipeline continue to go to Ukraine and use the threat of cutting them off as a lever to get Ukraine to go along with the deal that Trump works out with the Russians. I mean, that may be their thinking. It's just very hard to tell. China has grown more powerful economically. It's turned a lot of that economic might into military might. And as you would expect, they're beginning to, throw their weight around. They're acting much the way the United States acts. As you well know, the United States has a Navy that has a significant forward presence, and we're constantly roaming around in the waters right off the coast of countries like China. This is just sort of the normal course of events for us. And what you should expect to happen is, as China gets more powerful, that it's going to build a blue water navy with a lot of power projection capability, and it's going to try to throw its weight around. It's going to try to send signals to the Australians, send signals to the Filipinos that we're in charge here. I think that's a misreading of the Chinese. The Chinese are not a status quo power. They want to dominate the South China Sea, and this explains a lot of what's going on with the Philippines. And they want to reduce American influence as much as possible in East Asia, and if anything, push the Americans beyond the first island chain, then beyond the second island chain. Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the Chinese are hardball players. They are interested in dominating East Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's commonplace in this country to make the argument that it's the United States the source of all trouble in East Asia, and that the Chinese are basically satisfied with the status quo. And if the Americans would just back off, we could live happily ever after. I think what they're doing is they're asserting their influence in East Asia. So you want to accept the reality that's facing us and figure out where to go from there. And basically that leads you to the conclusion that it's best from our point of view, and here I'm talking about the United States, and it's best from Ukraine's point of view to shut this war down. And if it goes on, what's going to happen? More Ukrainians are going to get killed and they're going to lose more territory. Is that good? Not in my opinion. In my opinion, from both a moral and a strategic point of view, Trump is on the right track. The fact is that the United States refused to tell Ukraine that it would continue to provide security for it, that it would continue to support it in its war with Russia. So the mineral deal went nowhere. And again, this is why Zelensky is so frustrated today in this press conference before the meeting. Zelensky has no solution. The mineral deal didn't work out the way he wanted. So what is he going to do? And he misbehaved, and we saw the end result. The mineral deal, the whole idea was initiated by Zelensky. And really what he wanted to do was allow the United States to make a lot of money from Ukrainian minerals. And the quid pro quo would be that the United States would continue to provide security for Ukraine. My view is that it is likely that Trump will cut a deal with Trump and company. Surely know what the Russians want. They know what the Russian demands are. And it appears that they're willing to meet those demands. Otherwise, Trump wouldn't be saying that he had a really good conversation with Putin and that they understand each other and that he believes they can get a deal. So I think the deal is going to happen. Well, you want to remember that once Germany is on its own and Germany has to provide for its own security, it will think about the world much more differently than it does now, because now it has the United States sitting on top of it. Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons. What's going to happen if the United States leaves to Germany in the pursuit of nuclear weapons? Are they going to get their own nuclear weapons? Are they not? And furthermore, in between Germany and Russia, there is a lot of territory, and there's a lot of potential for conflict in that piece of territory between Russia and Germany, and a security competition could take place. So there are just all sorts of scenarios that are hard to predict that lead to big trouble. And what you want to do if you're a European is you want to head this trouble off at the pass. And the best way to do that is to keep Uncle Sam firmly enmeshed in the European security equation. I think they think that threat inflation is essential to keep their publics on board, and also as a way to maybe convince the Americans that the boogeyman is coming and that Europe needs help from the United States, much the way it did in World War I. There's an important economic dimension, but it's very important to understand that a large-scale American military presence in Europe serves as a pacifier. The Europeans like being subservient to the United States because the United States keeps the peace. Their great fear is not so much that the Russians are going to attack into Western Europe. Their great fear is that the Americans are going to leave and they're going to be left on their own. And they know what's happened in the past when they were left on their own. And it usually is not a happy ending. But what Trump wants to do is shut down the war as soon as possible. And that is in Ukraine's interest. It's not in Ukraine's interest to continue this war. And although Zelensky thinks that's the case, he's just dead wrong. He has no real option here other than to go along with what President Trump wants. And as you and I have said on countless occasions, actually, what Trump wants is what's best for Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't realize that, and most Ukrainians don't realize that. So in a very important way, I think that what Trump wants to do is good for Ukraine. He's made it very clear that Ukraine cannot be in NATO, and there's nothing that Zelensky can do to change that. Whether Zelensky came to Washington and behaved much the way Starmer and Macron did, or whether he behaved the way he actually did today, it just doesn't matter. Let's face it, he's between a rock and a hard place. He's the head of a country that is in the process of being destroyed. He has no way to fix the problem. And he's, I think, just frustrated beyond belief. And that was reflected in his performance today. Again, it wasn't a smart way to behave, for sure. But in a certain way, I can understand his frustration. Playing nice with Trump and Vance is not going to solve his problem, or at least it's not going to end up producing the result he wants, which is continuation of the war and support for the United States, from the United States for that enterprise. That's what he wants. What Zelensky wants is possible to get from the United States at this point in time, period, end of story. There's no way that we can turn this one around so that Ukraine wins. Joe Biden did everything he could to help the Ukrainians. And when Joe Biden left office, the Ukrainians were losing and the Russians were on the march. And there's no evidence that we have any way of altering the balance of power on the battlefield. I think the big problem for Trump moving forward, and here we're talking mainly about Ukraine, is not the Russians. I think the big problem is the Europeans, and an even bigger problem is the Ukrainians. And the fact is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians do not want to cut a deal with Putin. And the deal that Trump appears to be working out is one that is antithetical to them. I think that he understands that Putin is a tough customer. I think he understands that Putin is in the driver's seat. And I think he understands that he's going to have to accommodate the Russians in large part if he wants to get a deal over Ukraine. So the question is, let's assume that Putin and Trump work out a deal. What happens then with the Ukrainians and the Europeans? I think probably Trump can coerce the Europeans. He has a lot of cards to play with the Europeans. They're not playing a powerful hand, and he can get them on board. But the Ukrainians are a different matter. It'd be very difficult to get them to accept the parameters of the deal that appears to be on the table. Well, the counter to that is that the Europeans will pick up the slack. And if you believe the Europeans cannot pick up the slack and that the United States will have coercive leverage over the Europeans, and I believe those two things, then the Ukrainians are pretty much on their own. And the Ukrainians on their own up against the Russians, it's really Bambi versus Godzilla. But the best solution is to create a neutral Ukraine that doesn't threaten Russia, and then have Ukraine do everything it can to have decent relations with Russia. But the number of people who make that argument are very small, and it's an argument that's been very hard to sell. I think it's an argument that Trump and his lieutenants have bought onto. I think they agree with us. But again, they may get that deal with the Russians. But the question is, can you get the Ukrainians and the